The battle is over. So much loss. What do we do now? We must survive.
There's a question that haunts every honest study of warfare. A question that textbooks often avoid and that popular culture carefully sanitizes. What happened to the women when the swords stopped swinging and the banners fell? In feudal Japan, where the samurai code of Bushido spoke endlessly of honor, loyalty, and dignified death, there existed a darker reality that the scrolls rarely documented and that the victors seldom admitted. The treatment of female prisoners after battle reveals a truth about war that transcends culture and era, a truth that forces us to look beyond the polished armor and philosophical codes to see the human cost of conquest. Before we walk through these blood-soaked chapters of history together, I need to know, which country are you watching from right now? And what time of day is it where you are? Drop your answer in the comments because you're about to step into a world where honor and brutality existed side by side, where the same warrior who would compose poetry about cherry blossoms might decide the fate of captive women with terrifying finality. The year is 1587. And you're standing in the ruins of what was once a prosperous castle town in Kyushu. The siege lasted 3 weeks. The smell of smoke still hangs in the morning air, mixing with something worse, something you don't want to name. Around you, samurai warriors move through the destroyed buildings with methodical purpose, their armor stained with battle, their faces showing the exhaustion of men who haven't slept properly in days. Some are searching for valuables, others are rounding up survivors. And among those survivors, you see women and children being herded into groups, their faces showing terror that needs no translation across the centuries. What you're witnessing is the immediate aftermath of castle warfare in the Sengoku period, Japan's age of civil war, and it's about to teach you things about samurai culture that the movies never showed you. The samurai weren't just warriors, they were administrators, landholders, and instruments of political power in a fractured nation where warfare had become almost constant. And in this world of constant conflict, captives weren't just unfortunate bystanders. They were currency, commodities, and sometimes casualties of a brutal calculus that had nothing to do with the honor codes we associate with samurai culture today. Let me take you back further to understand how we arrived at this moment. The Sengoku period, spanning roughly from 1467 to 1615, transformed Japan into a landscape of perpetual war. The central authority had collapsed. The emperor remained a symbolic figure with no real power, and across the islands, hundreds of daimyo, powerful feudal lords, fought each other for supremacy, for survival, for the dream of unifying the nation under their own banner. In this context, warfare became industrialized in a way that medieval Japan had never experienced before. Armies grew larger, battles became more frequent, and the treatment of conquered populations became a strategic consideration that commanders had to address with cold practicality. The samurai class, bound by the code of Bushido, theoretically operated under principles of honor, loyalty, and propriety. The word Bushido itself means the way of the warrior, and its tenets emphasized courage, benevolence, and respect. But here's what the simplified versions of history don't tell you. Bushido was never a unified written code during the Sengoku period. It was a collection of customs, expectations, and ideals that varied significantly between clans and changed dramatically depending on circumstances. A samurai might write beautiful poetry about loyalty and death one day, and the next day participate or order actions that violated every principle those poems celebrated. Now let's talk specifically about what happened to female prisoners, because this is where the distance between ideal and reality becomes almost unbearable. When a castle fell or a territory was conquered, the victorious army faced immediate questions. What do we do with the defeated population? How do we prevent rebellion? How do we reward our troops? How do we send messages to other enemies about the cost of resistance? The answers to these questions determined the fate of thousands of women across centuries of Japanese warfare, and those answers were rarely gentle. The first thing you need to understand is that female captives fell into different categories, and their treatment varied accordingly based on their social status, age, and perceived value. Noble women, wives and daughters of defeated samurai or daimyo, occupied a unique position. They were valuable political assets. A captured noblewoman could be married off to solidify alliances, held as hostage to ensure cooperation, or in some cases, forced to become concubines to legitimize a conqueror's claim to territory. Their bodies became instruments of political transition, their marriages or captivities serving strategic purposes that had nothing to do with their own wishes or well-being. But social status only protected you to a point, and only if the victorious commander saw advantage in that protection. History records numerous instances where noble women faced the same brutal treatment as commoners when strategic considerations pointed in that direction. The siege of Odawara in 1590 provides a documented example. When Hideyoshi, the man who would ultimately unify Japan, laid siege to the Hojo clan's stronghold, the surrender terms were negotiated partly around the treatment of female members of the Hojo family. Some were absorbed into Hideyoshi's court, others were married to his allies. Their fate was determined entirely by political calculation, their previous status mattering only insofar as it could be exploited. For commoner women, the situation was often far more dire and immediate. These were the wives, daughters, and sisters of Ashigaru, the foot soldiers who made up the bulk of samurai armies. They were farmers' families, merchants' wives, servants in castle towns. When their communities fell to enemy forces, they had no political value to protect them, no strategic importance to ensure their safety. What happened to them depended entirely on the discipline of the conquering army, the orders of its commander, and sometimes just the chaos of the moment. Mass enslavement was common. Victorious armies would round up women and children as war spoils. Distributing them to warriors as rewards or selling them to merchants was specialized in the human trade. Portuguese Jesuit missionaries who arrived in Japan during the late 16th century documented this practice with horror, writing letters back to Europe describing how Japanese warriors would attack villages specifically to capture people for sale. One Jesuit priest wrote in 1585 about seeing hundreds of Japanese women and children being sold in markets in Kyushu, some destined for domestic servitude, others for worse fates. The international slave trade that developed during this period adds another layer of darkness to the story. Japanese captives, including women taken in warfare, were sometimes sold to Portuguese and Dutch traders who would transport them as far as Goa, Macau, and even South America. This practice became so widespread that in 1587, Toyotomi Hideyoshi issued an edict prohibiting the sale of Japanese people to foreigners, not out of humanitarian concern, but because he saw it as diminishing Japan's population and therefore its military strength. The edict was inconsistently enforced, and the trade continued in various forms for decades. Sexual violence was endemic, though it's one of the aspects of samurai warfare that Japanese historians have often glossed over or omitted entirely. The reality is that conquering armies throughout history have used sexual violence as both a weapon and a reward, and samurai armies were no exception. When a castle fell after a long siege, when troops had endured weeks or months of hardship and danger, commanders often gave implicit or explicit permission for their men to take what they wanted from the conquered population. This wasn't seen as violation of Bushido because the captives weren't considered to have the same human status as the warriors themselves. There are documented instances where the treatment of female prisoners became a deliberate terror tactic. Oda Nobunaga, one of the great unifiers of Japan and a commander whose military genius was matched only by his brutality, understood that mercy could be a weakness in the eyes of future enemies. When he destroyed the Enryakuji monastery on Mount Hiei in 1571, slaughtering thousands of monks, nuns, and civilians, he was sending a message about the cost of resistance. Throughout his campaigns, Nobunaga's treatment of conquered populations, including women, was calculated to create such fear that other enemies would surrender rather than face similar destruction. But here's where the story becomes more complex, and this is important. Not all samurai commanders operated the same way, and not all captives faced the same fate. Some daimyo recognized that excessive brutality could be counterproductive, creating bitter enemies where cooperative subjects might have been cultivated. Date Masamune, the powerful lord of northern Japan, was known for relatively moderate treatment of conquered populations, understanding that he needed to govern territories after he conquered them. Women in areas he captured might be displaced, might lose their homes and livelihoods, but weren't systematically enslaved or killed. The concept of honor in samurai culture also created some unexpected protections, though these were inconsistent and often dependent on individual interpretation. Some samurai warriors genuinely believed that harming women and children dishonored them as warriors. There are accounts of individual samurai refusing to participate in atrocities against captives, sometimes at personal cost. These were exceptions rather than rules, but they remind us that even in the darkest chapters of history, human conscience sometimes asserted itself against the momentum of violence. Religious institutions occasionally provided sanctuary, though this protection was fragile and politically dependent. Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines sometimes sheltered female refugees, and some warlords respected these sanctuaries, at least temporarily. But as the Enryakuji massacre demonstrated, religious protection meant nothing when a commander decided that military necessity overrode spiritual concerns. The monasteries themselves were military powers during this era, maintaining armed forces and participating in the conflicts, which meant that their claim to neutrality was often questionable. If you're watching this and feeling disturbed, if you're wondering how warriors who wrote poetry and practiced tea ceremony could participate in or permit such actions, then you're starting to understand the central contradiction of samurai culture. Bushido wasn't hypocrisy exactly. It was a code designed for interactions between samurai, for how warriors treated other warriors, for maintaining honor within a specific social class. It simply didn't extend fully to those outside that class, especially not to the defeated enemies and their families. Let me share something that might help you grasp the mindset. Imagine you're a samurai warrior in 1580. You've been trained since childhood to see yourself as fundamentally different from commoners, to view combat as your reason for existence, to believe that your lord's commands are absolute. You've watched friends die in battle, you've killed men in face-to-face combat, you've lived for months on campaign in harsh conditions. When your army finally takes a castle after a brutal siege, when your commander tells you that the spoils are yours, you don't see prisoners the way we might see them today. You see rewards, resources, proof of your valor. The conceptual gap between that worldview and modern humanitarian values is almost impossible to fully bridge.
Now here's something that the history books often miss because they focus on battles and politics rather than individual human experiences. Some women survived captivity and found ways to navigate their new circumstances. This isn't to romanticize or minimize their trauma, but to recognize their resilience and agency even in terrible situations. Some women taken as concubines eventually gained influence in their captors' households, becoming advisors or power brokers. Some enslaved women eventually earned or purchased their freedom. Some adapted, survived, and found ways to protect their children or other captives. There were also documented instances of women choosing death over capture. The samurai ideal of honorable suicide, while primarily associated with male warriors, sometimes extended to women facing the prospect of capture and dishonor. Some noble women killed themselves and their children rather than fall into enemy hands. Some castle households had established protocols for this, designated places where women would gather to die together if the fortress fell. This was seen not as tragedy, but as the honorable choice, the maintenance of dignity in the face of inevitable violation. The psychological impact on survivors was rarely documented, but we can infer it from the fragments that remain. Letters between family members sometimes reference women who were recovered from captivity but never fully reintegrated into their communities, who carried shame that their culture placed on victims rather than perpetrators. Some women who survived captivity and returned home found themselves unmarriageable, socially tainted by experiences that weren't their choice. The trauma extended across generations, though it was rarely acknowledged or addressed in ways that modern psychology would recognize as healing. Now let's talk about something that might surprise you. There were legal and customary frameworks that theoretically governed the treatment of prisoners, including women. Various daimyo issued codes of conduct for their warriors, some of which included provisions about the treatment of captives. Takeda Shingen, one of the great commanders of the Sengoku period, had explicit rules for his troops regarding prisoners. But the distance between official policy and actual practice, especially in the chaos immediately following battle, was often vast. Commanders might issue orders protecting certain categories of captives, while tacitly allowing or ignoring violations of those same orders. The unification of Japan under the Tokugawa shogunate after 1615 gradually changed these dynamics. As warfare became less frequent and central authority strengthened, the treatment of women in conquered territories became more regulated, more predictable, and generally less brutal. But this was a shift that took decades and was driven more by the consolidation of power than by evolving moral consciousness. The samurai class began to romanticize and formalize Bushido during the peaceful Edo period, creating many of the idealized versions of the code that would later influence Western perceptions. The brutal realities of the Sengoku period were quietly forgotten or rewritten. If you've made it this far in this story, take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who thinks they understand samurai culture. Because what we're exploring here isn't just Japanese history, it's a window into how all cultures process the contradiction between their ideals and their actions, between the stories they tell about themselves and the realities they'd rather forget. Modern Japan's relationship with this history is complicated. The samurai are cultural icons, symbols of discipline, loyalty, and honor. Movies, anime, and literature celebrate Bushido and the warrior ethos, but the darker aspects of samurai warfare, including the treatment of female prisoners, receive far less attention in popular culture or even in some academic contexts. There's an understandable desire to preserve cultural pride and heritage, but that preservation sometimes comes at the cost of historical honesty about suffering and injustice. International perspectives have sometimes forced more honest examination. When Western historians and critics began writing about Japanese warfare in the mid-20th century, they sometimes highlighted aspects that domestic sources had minimized. This created tension between nationalist narratives and more critical historical analysis. The conversation continues today, with some Japanese historians advocating for more complete acknowledgement of wartime atrocities across all periods, while others resist what they see as unfair focus on negative aspects of their cultural heritage. Understanding what happened to female prisoners after samurai battles also helps us understand broader patterns about warfare and gender across cultures and eras. The systematic targeting of women during conflict, whether through enslavement, sexual violence, or forced marriage, appears in virtually every sustained military conflict in human history. Ancient Rome, medieval Europe, the Mongol conquests, the wars of religion, modern conflicts in Rwanda and Bosnia. The pattern repeats with horrific consistency. This isn't about singling out samurai culture as uniquely brutal. It's about recognizing that warfare creates conditions where ordinary moral constraints collapse and where women's bodies become contested territory in ways that reflect and reinforce existing power hierarchies.
The economic dimension of female captivity in feudal Japan deserves deeper examination too. War captives, including women, represented transferable wealth in an economy where coinage was less dominant than in other contemporary societies. A healthy woman could be sold for prices that sustained a warrior for months or enriched a merchant significantly. This created perverse incentives where warfare became partially motivated by the capture of saleable humans. Some battles were fought specifically to acquire captives, with territory being almost secondary to the human spoils. There were also cultural mechanisms that processed and justified these practices. Buddhist concepts of karma and reincarnation could be twisted to suggest that those who suffered were paying for transgressions in past lives. Confucian hierarchy placed women below men in explicit social ordering, making their suffering seem less significant to those who accepted that framework uncritically. Shinto purity concepts could mark captured or violated women as contaminated, shifting shame from perpetrators to victims. These weren't just abstract philosophical points, they were the mental frameworks that allowed people to participate in or accept terrible actions without seeing themselves as terrible people. Personal accounts from this period are rare, especially from women, because literacy was limited and because the historical record was kept primarily by and for the elite male warriors and administrators. But fragments survive. In some family archives, in occasional temple records, in the margins of official histories, we find glimpses of individual women's experiences. A letter from a mother whose daughter was taken in a raid. A brief mention in a merchant's ledger of females purchased from war captain. A Buddhist nun's testimony about women who sought sanctuary after escaping captivity. These fragments are precious not just as historical evidence, but as reminders that these weren't abstract populations, but individuals with names, families, hopes, and trauma. The role of women in samurai households during this period provides important context, too. Samurai women weren't passive ornaments. They managed complex households, oversaw finances, and in their husband's absence, sometimes directed military defense. Some women received martial training and could fight. The famous Ana Bugeisha, female warriors, were real, though less common than popular culture might suggest. This makes the vulnerability of women during conquest even more tragic. Some of these captives would have had skills and status in peacetime, but found those attributes meant nothing when facing a victorious enemy army. Technological and tactical changes in warfare also affected how battles ended, and thus how female prisoners were treated. Early in the Sengoku period, warfare often involved relatively small numbers of mounted samurai in somewhat ritualized combat. As the period progressed, armies grew larger, tactics became more sophisticated, and firearms introduced from Portugal changed the nature of battle. Sieges became more devastating, involving months of bombardment and starvation. When a castle finally fell after such prolonged suffering, the conquering army often felt entitled to compensation for their hardships, and that sense of entitlement manifested in how they treated captives. The question of resistance is also important. We have records of women resisting captivity in various ways. Some fought back physically when attacked, sometimes successfully. Some escaped from captors during the confusion of army movements. Some managed to negotiate their own release through connections or payment. Some organized collective resistance among captives. These stories of agency and resistance are harder to find in the historical record than stories of victimization, but they're there if you look carefully, reminding us that even in the most constrained circumstances, people find ways to assert their humanity and fight for their survival. Children born from wartime sexual violence add another layer of complexity and tragedy to this history. Some of these children were accepted into their mothers' communities, though often with stigma attached. Some were raised as servants or slaves. Some were killed by mothers who saw no future for them. Some were taken into samurai households and raised as retainers or servants. The fate of these children was another aspect of the legacy of conquest that extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of battle, affecting families and communities for generations. Alliance dynamics also influenced the treatment of female prisoners. When two daimyo became allies after conflict, the return or respectful treatment of captives from both sides might be part of the peace negotiation. Women who had been taken as war prizes might be returned to their families as a gesture of reconciliation, though this was more likely for noble women whose families had political leverage. For commoner women without such connections, captivity often became permanent, their previous lives and identities effectively erased. Before we reach the end of this journey together, I want you to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because we're going to continue exploring the gaps between historical myth and historical reality, the stories that don't make it into simplified narratives, but that teach us the most about human nature and the real costs of the systems we create.
Religious syncretism in Japan meant that multiple philosophical and spiritual frameworks coexisted, sometimes creating contradictions in how people understood moral responsibility. A samurai might practice Zen Buddhism, which emphasized compassion and the illusion of the self, while simultaneously participating in actions that violated those principles. He might honor his ancestors through Shinto ritual, while dishonoring the ancestors of his enemies by destroying their descendants. This wasn't necessarily conscious hypocrisy. It was the result of living in a culture where different domains of life operated under different ethical systems, where compartmentalization was a survival strategy in a morally complex world. The aftermath period, the weeks and months following conquest, is where some of the most significant but least documented suffering occurred. Immediate violence during and right after battle was terrible but relatively brief. The grinding reality of captivity, the forced labor, the sexual exploitation, the separation from family, the loss of identity and status played out over months and years in ways that left fewer dramatic records but caused immense cumulative harm. A woman enslaved after a battle in 1580 might spend the rest of her life in that condition, might raise children who were also slaves, might die never having recovered her freedom or her name. The psychological tools that warriors used to distance themselves from the suffering they caused are worth examining too. Dehumanization, the ability to see enemy populations as fundamentally different and less worthy of moral consideration, appears across all warfare, but took specific forms in Sengoku Japan. The classification systems of social hierarchy, the rhetoric of loyalty to one's lord above all else, the cultivation of emotional detachment as a warrior virtue, all of these created mental space between action and moral consequence. A samurai could compose a poem about the tragedy of existence in the morning and participate in atrocities in the afternoon without necessarily experiencing that as cognitive dissonance. We should also acknowledge what we can't know. The historical record for this period, particularly regarding the experiences of non-elite individuals, and especially women, is fragmentary. Much of what we understand comes from inference, from patterns across limited evidence, from reading between the lines of documents written for other purposes. Some scholars estimate that we have written records relating to less than 5% of the significant events of the Sengoku period, and within those records, detailed information about the treatment of female prisoners is even rarer. So when we discuss this history, we're working with incomplete information, which should make us appropriately cautious about sweeping generalizations while still recognizing clear patterns in the evidence we do have. The legacy of this period extends into modern warfare and modern discussions about conflict and gender. International humanitarian law, including the Geneva Convention's provisions on the treatment of civilians and prisoners, was developed partly in response to the cyclical pattern of wartime atrocities across cultures and eras. The specific recognition of sexual violence as a war crime, particularly after conflicts in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, represents an evolution in how the international community addresses these issues. Japan's own history with this question became particularly fraught during and after World War II, with the comfort women issue representing a continuation of some of the same patterns we've discussed from the Sengoku period, though in a very different context and scale. For contemporary Japan, this history poses difficult questions about national identity and historical memory. The samurai remain powerful cultural symbols, representing discipline, loyalty, and martial excellence. Movies and television shows set in the Sengoku period are popular entertainment. The period's aesthetics, the castles, the armor, the swords, are celebrated cultural heritage. But engaging honestly with what that period meant for women, for commoners, for the defeated and the vulnerable, requires a more complex and sometimes uncomfortable narrative than the one popular culture typically offers. This tension isn't unique to Japan. Every nation struggles with integrating the darker aspects of its history into its self-image,
but it's particularly visible in how this specific period is remembered and represented. So what does all of this mean for us, watching from the 21st century, trying to understand a world separated from us by hundreds of years and fundamentally different social structures? First, it means recognizing that honor codes and ethical systems often contain enormous blind spots, protecting some while abandoning others to suffering. Second, it means understanding that warfare creates conditions where ordinary morality collapses and where systematic cruelty can be perpetrated by people who don't see themselves as cruel. Third, it means acknowledging that historical progress, to whatever extent it exists, is uneven, contested, and fragile, requiring constant effort to maintain and extend protections for the vulnerable.
The treatment of female prisoners after samurai battles also teaches us about the nature of testimony and historical knowledge. The people who experienced these events as victims rarely controlled the narrative afterward. Their voices were systematically excluded from the official record, their suffering minimized or ignored in histories written by and for the victors. This pattern of exclusion means that recovering historical truth requires active effort to seek out marginal sources, to read dominant narratives critically, to acknowledge what we cannot know while still taking seriously what we can infer. It's a methodology that applies far beyond this specific historical question. As we conclude this exploration, I want you to consider this. The distance between ideal and practice, between the stories cultures tell about themselves and the realities they enact, exists not just in feudal Japan, but in every society, including our own. The samurai spoke of honor while participating in or permitting terrible things. What contradictions exist in our own time that future historians might examine with similar clarity? What suffering do our systems produce that we've found ways not to see or to justify? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're invitations to think seriously about how power, ethics, and human suffering intersect in every era, including this one. The women who suffered during the Sengoku period are mostly forgotten now. They don't have monuments. Their names weren't recorded in most cases. Their pain didn't shape the grand narratives of the period in official histories, but their experiences were real. Their suffering mattered, and understanding what happened to them, even in fragmentary and imperfect ways, is part of reckoning honestly with what warfare means, what conquest costs, and what honor actually requires versus what it's often used to justify. I want to know what you think about all of this. Drop a comment below sharing your perspective on how we should remember historical periods that contain both remarkable achievements and terrible injustices. How do we honor cultural heritage while acknowledging its shadow sides? Is it possible to admire aspects of samurai culture while condemning specific practices? These are questions without easy answers, but they're questions worth wrestling with seriously. The battlefield eventually fell silent. The fires burned out. The armies moved on to the next conflict, the next campaign, the next season of war. But for the women whose lives were shattered in those moments of conquest, the aftermath continued long after the warriors had left. In the silences of the historical record, in the stories not told and the voices not preserved, their experiences remain as a reminder that every victory has a cost, that every tale of honor contains untold stories of suffering, and that the true measure of any society isn't found in its greatest achievements, but in how it treats those with the least power when no one is watching or remembering. That's the shock the title promised. Not a single horrifying act, but a systematic pattern that forces us to see samurai warfare, and perhaps all warfare, with clearer and more honest eyes.